Hello. I want to thank you again for tuning into our study through the book of Proverbs. We're here with the 17th edition of our study through the book of Proverbs. We are over halfway now, and in the 17th chapter of the book of Proverbs, there is no lackadaisical attitude taken. Right out of the gate, we're hot, okay? So I want to dive right into this. Verses 1 through 5 are really something, so I really want to dive into this. Let's look at verse 1 together in the 17th chapter of the book of Proverbs. It says, "Better is a dry morsel and quietness with it than a house full of sacrifices with strife." Now, something that we lose in the English translation is that that word sacrifices is literally the same word that they would use for peace sacrifices. Now, the pertinence of that is that peace sacrifices usually involved a meat sacrifice, okay? So this is the kind of thing that you would do as a luxury. It was a very luxurious concept that only the wealthy would be able to take part in. And so what this is saying, more or less, is that it's better to be poor and have some quietness and peace in your house than it is to have a house full of luxury and wealth and have strife with it. And I think most of us know that there's truth in that. We know this because anytime that there's a death, at least in most families, the first thing that happens the person's body is barely cold. They're not even put in the grave yet, and people are talking about inheritances. You know, was there a will, and who gets what, and who gets to decide, and this always becomes a mess every time that there's a death in a family. So all we know is that anytime that there's wealth involved, anytime that there is luxury involved, all of a sudden there's strife. It's better to just be poor. That's what the Bible tells us. So the terminology is that it's better to be poor and at peace with your family than wealthy and in a state of strife. Let's look at verse 2. It says, "A wise servant will have rule over a son that causes shame, and will have part in the inheritance among the brothers." Now this is a perfect example of the premonition of the will of God for the Gentiles, because what we find throughout the Bible is that God is constantly trying to reintegrate the Gentiles into His plan of salvation, against their will in many cases. And so what we find is that what we've got here in 17:2 is that it says a wise servant will have rule over a son that causes shame. And as you read the New Testament, specifically in the books of, say, Luke and Acts and Romans, you're going to see that God has done everything necessary to reintegrate the Gentiles into His family, because at some point they became wiser servants than the sons that He had in the children of Israel. This is what is essentially being conveyed through the prodigal son parable. The prodigal son is the one that demands his inheritance. He goes out of the house. That is the leaving of the Gentiles out of the nation of Israel. And essentially that would be the desecration of the relationship of God, either through the line of Cain or again through the line of the children of Noah. And so those children leave, and God has His chosen children in the children of Israel, and He's trying to reintegrate them. And so that son goes out, he squanders his inheritance. He says, "I'll go back and just be a servant of my father." And when he comes back, he has a son that stayed, but this son is the one that he kills the fatted calf for, takes the rings off of his fingers, takes a robe off of his back, throws a big party of celebration. And the son that stayed home is just angry, because he can't believe that his father is willing to accept the son back, let alone to throw this great celebration. "You never killed the fatted calf for me." So that is an illustration of the nation of Israel and the Gentiles. The Gentiles went out, desecrated everything that God thought was holy, or God held as holy, disobeyed His word, squandered every blessing that He had given them. And the Israelites, the children of Israel, stayed there with Him, followed His law, stayed at home. But when the Gentiles came back through the ministry of Jesus Christ, and especially through the ministry of Paul and the epistles and his ministries across the Mediterranean, what we find is that the Gentiles are reintegrated, and the Israelites, the children of Israel, don't want to handle it. That's why they had the whole Council of Jerusalem in the book of Acts, and Peter couldn't really believe it himself, and Paul had to be shown this by the proofs of the Spirit as well. So these sorts of things, the nation of Israel, the Jews, didn't want to accept that the Gentiles were being grafted back into the family of God, and that's what we find in Romans chapter 11. If you want to read that, God is telling the Gentiles to be very careful, because although they've been grafted onto the vine, they can just as easily be cut back off, and the Jews can be grafted back on as the only chosen nation that God is redeeming. So This is a perfect illustration of God's will for the Gentiles. The wise servant will have rule over a son that causes shame and have part in the inheritance among the brothers. They're not treated differently. They're treated like a brother, even though all they were was a wise servant. And it's even more implicated. We're going to find out more later on about a son that causes shame. We're going to see that, but I'm getting ahead of myself. Let's look at verse 3. The fining pot is for silver and the furnace for gold, but the Lord tries the hearts. Excuse me. Now, a fining pot we today would call a crucible. So what it says here is that it uses the illustration of a crucible and a furnace to explain to you how that God tries your hearts. So what this means is that God tests us through adversity. What he does is he puts a little bit of flame under us just to get us boiling, and then the dross, the nastiness, the imperfections, the impurity comes up to the top, and he skims that off. And eventually all that's left is purity. And that's what he's talking about throughout the New Testament. Be ye perfect, your Father in heaven is perfect. Find an imperfection in your life and rid yourself of it. You don't have to do it all at one time. Do it step by step. Because we're constantly supposed to be pursuing perfection. We press on to know. Paul says this, I do not speak as one who has attained perfection. And then he begins to talk in the verbiage of a race. He says, I've ran the race, I've kept the faith, I've finished the course. So he talks about this as if it's something that's a system of pursuit, where we're supposed to be pursuing perfection and ridding ourselves of imperfection. And God does this by putting us in the crucible and molding us and putting us in the melting pot, the furnace, and melting off the dross and harvesting that away so that we're left pure and that he can test us and deal with us. Let's look at verse 5. Whoever mocks the poor reproaches his maker, and he that is glad at calamity shall not be unpunished. This is again a hearkening back to what we've seen in previous chapters. I think in chapter 14, the final verse, verse 31, that's not the final verse, but verse 31, he that oppresses the poor reproaches his maker, he that honors him has mercy on the poor. So what he's saying is that we don't need to forget that the poor are still image bearers of God. God is their maker and their father as well as ours. And so it doesn't matter that we're wealthy and live in luxury and they live in poverty. He is still their father as well as ours. God does not look on the outward appearance, but he looks on the heart. So to look on somebody who's poor and look down on them and mock them is to reproach God, because they are image bearers of God. They bear the Imago Dei. And furthermore, to rejoice in the calamities of others is to be totally punished by God on the day of reckoning, because we are actually rejoicing in the fact that other people have fallen. We shouldn't do these things. Now, there is something to be said about recognizing why that somebody is suffering calamity, but never to be celebrating it. Even when wickedness is punished, we ought not celebrate it. Okay? We don't find anything like that in heaven. There's no note of people celebrating that the wicked are being punished in hell. It's not something to be celebrated. It's something to be recognized as a glory to God and a justice of righteousness. So we shouldn't disrespect God by looking down on the poor, and we shouldn't disrespect God by celebrating the calamity of others, because even those that are undergoing calamity and punishment from God are still image bearers of his. Let's look at verse 9. He that covers a transgression seeks love, but he that repeats a matter separates very friends, or close friends. This is a good verse to be coupled with verse 14. The beginning of strife is as when one lets out water. Gosh, that's a tongue twister. Let me start that again. The beginning of strife is as when one lets out water. Therefore, leave off contention before it be meddled with. So this is saying that it's better to stay out of strife. It's better to just avoid it. If you see that something's about to be a problem within reason, get away from it. Now, Christians are not supposed to be settle in and live at peace with the world type of people. We're supposed to be engaging with people in the manner that Paul did when he comes to Mars Hill and he debates with the Athenians. We're supposed to be engaging people, not afraid of a debate or an argument, but in some manner we're supposed to be people that avoid strife, peaceful as doves and harmless as doves, but wise and as cunning as serpents. We're supposed to be people that are willing to engage and be courageous, be strong and courageous in the Lord, but we're not supposed to go about seeking chaos and strife and seeking arguments. So the people that can avoid these things are the wise. Let's look at verse 13. Whoever rewards evil for good, evil shall not depart from his house. This is a good verse to couple with verse 15. He that justifies the wicked and he that condemns the just, even they are both an abomination before the Lord. So those that reward evil and punish good are going to be met with fierce judgment before God. And this is something that we're going to see, especially when the judgment is rained down on America, because we have a total inability to rectify what we're doing in our legal system and the laws that we're making and the laws that we're forbidding when it comes to the biblical precedent. We are going to be so harshly and fiercely judged for the things that we're allowing to happen, specifically abortion and euthanasia, because we are calling these things good when they are most definitely evil things. Let's look at verse 17. A friend loves at all times, and a brother is born for adversity. And we're going to see more about good friends in chapter 18, specifically in verse 24. But I want to look at this from the perspective of Jesus, because this is an interesting verse as it refers to two things that Jesus is specifically called. Verse 17, a friend loves at all times, and a brother is born for adversity. So Jesus is referred to both of these things. In John chapter 15, Jesus says, I no longer call you servants, but I call you friends. In many songs we have now in our modern day, Jesus the friend of sinners. I have a friend in Jesus. Oh, what a friend we have in Jesus. So we know that Jesus is a friend, and it says that a friend loves at all times, but also a brother is born for adversity. And Paul writes in Romans chapter 8 and verse 29 about the resurrection of Christ. He says, Christ was the firstborn among many brethren. He's the first of all the brothers that are going to be raised from the dead. And this is interesting. It says that we'll also get an inheritance in like his. We'll have an inheritance like brethren. So, we're going to be looked at in one way or another in a spiritual sense as if we are the brothers and sisters of Christ. And we're all under our Father in heaven. And this is amazing that I'll be the brother of Christ. You know, James and his other literal physical brothers on earth will have no claim that I won't have to be a brother of Christ. That's awesome. A friend loves at all times, but a brother is born for adversity. And as I mentioned, in chapter 18, we're going to see a wonderful verse in verse 24 about friends and the person that Jesus is as a friend. Look at verse 25 as we're finishing up here. And verse 25 is a good verse to couple with verse 6, so we'll read those together. Verse 25, a foolish son is a grief to his father, and bitterness to her that bare him. Now go back and read verse 6. Children's children are the crown of old men, and the glory of children are their fathers. And this goes back to what we saw there in verse 2 about a son causing shame. We're going to see about good children and bad children and the repercussions of both. But this is a huge verse. Verse 6 says that your grandchildren are supposed to be blessings to you, and your children are supposed to be the glory of your life. I gain so much from having these kids. They make my life have purpose, and I'm so proud of them. But in verse 25, a foolish son is nothing but a grief to his father, and bitterness to the mother that bore him. The author is asserting again, as we saw in chapter 15, the blessedness of old age and being a grandparent, like we saw in verse 6, but also the blessedness in being a parent. But he also reflects on his own aging, saying that when he sees his children making foolish decisions, it brings him grief. It doesn't give him any pleasure to see his children making mistakes. He wishes that they would follow his wisdom. And in fact, we can see that by the fact that he wrote this entire book. He writes this book of Proverbs in the first 9 chapters exclusively to his children. He's telling them, listen to me, listen to me, listen to me. Don't make foolish decisions. And he might give us a gleaning and an insight as to why. He says, a foolish son is a grief to his father. I don't want to see my kids making the mistakes that perhaps I made. He reflects on his life as aging as a blessing, but he also reflects on his life as being a father as somewhat of a grief when he can't stop his children from doing wicked things. And thank God we have a Father who's forgiving, but he also reflects on this in saying that if we're foolish children of our Father in heaven, it's a grief to our Father. And I don't want to come before God and see him in grief. When I stand before the judgment seat of Christ, one of my favorite poems, when I stand before the judgment seat of Christ and see the plan that he had for me, shall I see grief in my Savior's eyes, grief though he loved me still. That's an awesome one. Look up that poem for yourself. I won't recite the whole thing for the sake of time, but when I stand at the judgment seat of Christ and I see his plan for me, look up that poem and read that poem. That's a wonderful poem. Thank you for listening. This has been the 17th edition of our study through the book of Proverbs. I want to admonish you to leave comments if you have any sort of recommendations or any sort of insights that we've missed here. I look forward to reading the rest of this book with you. Share this video if you're enjoying these studies. I'm Pastor Michael Shultz. Thank you again for listening, and be blessed.